In the remote hollows of eastern Kentucky, where morning mist clings to ancient ridgelines, like the breath of something that refuses to die, the Weaver family built their legacy on threads that should never have been spun. Their story begins not with birth certificates or land deeds, but with whispers that echo through generations of mountain folk who learned long ago that some names are spoken only in daylight and only when necessary. The winter of 1847 brought a cold so bitter that even the oldest settlers spoke of it in hushed tones. Livestock froze standing in their fields. Wells turned to solid ice 20 feet down. Children disappeared from their beds in the night, found days later in impossible places, their bodies unmarked, but their eyes holding the vacant stare of those who had seen something beyond human comprehension. It was during this cursed season that Ezekiel Weaver first arrived in what would later become known as Weaver's Hollow, carrying nothing but a leather satchel and a loom that seemed far too old for any one man to have built. Local records, what few survived the mysterious fires that plagued the county courthouse throughout the following decades, show no trace of where Ezekiel came from. He simply appeared as if materialized from the mountain fog itself. The families already scratching out meager existences in those isolated valleys watched him with the kind of suspicion reserved for strangers, in places where strangers meant trouble. But Ezekiel Weaver wasn't looking for trouble. He was looking for something far more dangerous. He was looking for customers. The first to approach him was Martha Hensley, a widow with 3 hungry children and a husband who died in a logging accident the previous spring. Her hands were raw from taking in washing, her back bent from hauling water up the mountain path to her cabin. When she heard the tale of a weaver who could make cloth finer than anything seen in those parts, she scraped together her last few coins and made the treacherous journey to the hollow where Ezekiel had built his workshop. What she found there defied explanation. The building itself seemed to shift and breathe in her peripheral vision, its walls crafted from timber that appeared to have grown in patterns no natural tree could produce. Inside, the air hummed with a sound like distant singing, though no singer could be seen. Ezekiel's loom dominated the center of the room, its frame carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, symbols that seemed to writhe and change when Martha tried to focus on them. But it was the cloth that truly captured her attention. Bolts of fabric in colors that had no names, textures that seemed to shift between rough and smooth depending on the angle of observation. When Ezekiel held up a length of deep blue material, Martha swore she could see the night sky moving within its fibers, complete with stars that twinkled and danced. "I can make you something special," Ezekiel said, his voice carrying the weight of promises and threats in equal measure. "Something that will change your fortune." Martha, desperate beyond reason, agreed to his terms without asking what they might be. 3 days later, she returned to find a dress of such exquisite beauty that she wept upon seeing it. The fabric seemed to glow with its own inner light, and when she wore it to the trading post in town, men stopped their conversations mid-sentence just to stare. The merchant who had been haggling over the price of her eggs suddenly offered twice what they were worth. The banker who had been threatening foreclosure on her late husband's debts suddenly found reasons to extend her payments indefinitely. Word of the miraculous dress spread through the mountains like wildfire. Soon, a steady stream of desperate souls made their way to Weaver's Hollow, each carrying their own burdens of poverty, illness, and desperation. Ezekiel welcomed them all with the patient demeanor of a man who had been expecting them. His prices were never monetary. Instead, he asked for things that seemed trivial at first: a lock of hair from a beloved child, the wedding ring of a deceased spouse, a photograph of a family member who had moved away. The transformations were immediate and undeniable. Sarah Mackenzie, who had been barren for 15 years of marriage, wore one of Ezekiel's shawls and conceived within a month. Thomas Ridgway, whose farm had produced nothing but withered crops for 3 seasons running, donned a vest woven by the mysterious craftsman and watched his fields explode with growth that defied the poor mountain soil. Elizabeth Cormack, whose husband beat her nightly in drunken rages, wrapped herself in a cloak of midnight black and found her spouse dead the next morning, apparently from a heart attack, though the man was barely 30 and had never shown signs of illness. But gifts given by mountain folk always come with hidden costs, and the Weaver family's true nature began to reveal itself as the seasons turned. Those who wore Ezekiel's creations found their fortunes improving in ways that seemed to defy natural law, but their families began experiencing strange afflictions. Children born to women who wore his cloth often came into the world with unusual marks, birthmarks that resembled the same writhing symbols carved into his loom. These children grew quickly, too quickly, often reaching adult size by age 10, but their minds remained somehow vacant, as if something essential had been extracted from them during their accelerated development. More disturbing still were the dreams. Every person who owned a piece of cloth from Weaver's Hollow reported the same recurring nightmare. They found themselves standing in a vast underground chamber, surrounded by looms operated by figures whose faces were obscured by shadow. The sound of weaving filled the air, but instead of thread, the looms worked with what appeared to be streams of light, streams that seemed to be pulled from the dreamers themselves. Upon waking, these individuals often discovered that their most cherished memories had become strangely dim, as if someone had been slowly unraveling the fabric of their past. Ezekiel himself seemed untouched by time's passage. While his customers aged and withered, he remained exactly as he had appeared that first winter, neither young nor old, but existing in some state that defied natural progression. His workshop grew larger, though no one ever saw construction taking place. Additional rooms simply appeared, each housing looms of increasing complexity and strangeness. Local children dared each other to peek through the windows after dark, reporting glimpses of the looms operating on their own, weaving patterns that made no sense to human eyes. The first generation of weavers to be born in the Hollow were Ezekiel's twin daughters, Constance and Prudence, who emerged from their mother's womb already possessed of their father's unnatural abilities. Their mother, a local woman named Rebecca Thorne, who had sought Ezekiel's help to escape an abusive father, died during childbirth, but not before whispering to the midwife that her daughters had been speaking to her from the womb, teaching her songs in languages that predated human civilization. The twins grew up as extensions of their father's dark craft, their small hands capable of weaving patterns that adult eyes couldn't follow. By age 7, they could create cloth that would make the wearer invisible to human sight. By 10, they had mastered the art of weaving memories themselves, creating tapestries that could alter the past experiences of anyone who gazed upon them for too long. By 15, they had surpassed their father in both skill and malevolence, creating works that could bind human souls to their threads. The family's influence spread throughout the region like a contagion. Merchants who wore weaver cloth found their businesses inexplicably prosperous, but at the cost of their competitors mysteriously failing. Politicians who donned garments from the hollow discovered themselves winning elections they had no business winning, but their victories came with an insatiable hunger for power that consumed their humanity. Ministers who accepted gifts of clerical vestments from the weavers found their congregations growing rapidly, but their sermons began to change, incorporating elements of worship that had no basis in any known religion. The Civil War brought new opportunities for the Weaver family to expand their influence. Both Union and Confederate forces passed through the region, and soldiers from both sides found themselves drawn to the hollow by rumors of protective clothing that could turn aside bullets. Ezekiel welcomed them all with equal enthusiasm, weaving uniforms that seemed to shimmer with protective enchantments. These garments did indeed protect their wearers from harm, but survivors of battles where weaver-clad soldiers fought reported disturbing details. The protected men seemed to move differently, their actions coordinated in ways that suggested they were no longer acting of their own free will. They fought with inhuman precision and showed no mercy to enemies or civilians alike. After the war ended, many of these soldiers never returned home. Their families received letters explaining that their loved ones had decided to settle in the mountains, but handwriting experts would later note that all these letters appeared to be written by the same hand. Investigations into their whereabouts invariably led to dead ends, with local authorities claiming no knowledge of the missing men. The true scope of the Weaver family's operations became apparent during the harsh winter of 1891, when a blizzard trapped several families in the region for nearly 2 months. Cut off from outside supplies, these isolated communities faced starvation. It was then that the weavers revealed another aspect of their craft. Constance and Prudence, now middle-aged women with children of their own, began weaving what they called sustenance cloth. Garments made from this material allowed the wearer to survive indefinitely without food or water, drawing nourishment from some unknown source. The cost of this miraculous sustenance became clear only after the spring thaw. Those who had worn the cloth during the winter found themselves fundamentally changed. They no longer cast shadows in direct sunlight. Their reflections in mirrors showed not their own faces, but the faces of strangers, people they had never met, but who seemed to be pleading silently for help. Most disturbing of all, they discovered that they could no longer taste food, could no longer feel the warmth of fire, could no longer experience physical pleasure or pain. The cloth had sustained their bodies by severing their connection to physical sensation, leaving them alive but fundamentally diminished. By the turn of the century, the Weaver family had grown into a small clan of individuals who seemed to exist outside the normal flow of human experience. Ezekiel's descendants possessed abilities that defied rational explanation. They could weave cloth from moonlight, creating garments that rendered the wearer invisible during nighttime hours. They could spin thread from human hair and create fabrics that would compel anyone who touched them to speak only the truth. Most remarkably, they could weave time itself, creating tapestries that depicted events that had not yet occurred, though these prophetic works came with the terrible cost of ensuring that the predicted events would indeed come to pass. The family's workshop had grown into a complex of buildings that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Visitors reported rooms that were larger inside than their external dimensions should have allowed, corridors that led back to their starting points despite appearing to run in straight lines, and chambers filled with looms that operated according to no mechanical principles that human engineering could comprehend. Local folklore began to speak of the Weaver's Hollow as a place where the boundaries between worlds had worn thin. Hunters reported seeing figures moving through the forest who cast no tracks, who seemed to glide above the ground rather than walk upon it. Travelers claimed to hear the sound of weaving emanating from deep within the earth, as if massive looms operated in caverns far below the surface. Children playing near the hollow's borders sometimes returned home, speaking of new friends who taught them games that involved arranging objects in patterns that made adults uncomfortable to look upon. The family's influence extended far beyond their immediate geographic area. Wealthy families from as far away as New York and Charleston began making pilgrimages to the Hollow, seeking custom garments that would grant them advantages in business and society. Railroad barons wore weaver waistcoats that seemed to ensure their trains arrived precisely on schedule, regardless of weather or mechanical difficulties. Steel magnates donned suits that made their workers unnaturally productive, though these employees often aged rapidly and died young from exhaustion. Politicians discovered that weaver-made garments could sway public opinion in their favor, but the cloth seemed to feed on controversy, ensuring that its wearers became embroiled in increasingly dramatic scandals. The price of these supernatural advantages became a family tradition passed down through generations of clients. The weavers never asked for immediate payment, but they always collected their debts. Sometimes the cost was extracted from the original customer, sometimes from their children or grandchildren. The family maintained meticulous records, tracking bloodlines and obligations across decades. Their accounting system defied conventional understanding, with debts that seemed to accumulate interest in ways that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the gradual erosion of human essence. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Weaver family had established themselves as the hidden architects of a network of influence that touched every level of society. Their cloth adorned the bodies of senators and robber barons, of judges and generals, of ministers and merchants. Each thread they wove carried with it a fragment of control, a subtle influence that bound the wearer to the family's incomprehensible agenda. But power of this magnitude never goes unnoticed forever. As we shall see, the Weaver family's dominion over the mountains and their growing influence over the outside world would soon attract attention from those who understood the true nature of their craft. Forces both human and otherwise began to take notice of the hollow where impossible things were woven from the very fabric of reality itself. The turn of the century brought new challenges to the Weaver legacy, but also unprecedented opportunities for expansion. As America entered the industrial age, the family's supernatural textile empire evolved to match the changing times, their influence spreading like threads through the fabric of a rapidly modernizing nation. By 1901, the third generation of weavers had established themselves not merely as craftsmen, but as architects of America's emerging power structure. Ezekiel's grandchildren possessed abilities that defied comprehension, their talents honed through decades of exposure to otherworldly forces that had shaped their bloodline in ways that science could never explain. Marcus Weaver, Ezekiel's eldest grandson, had inherited more than just the family business. At 28, he could weave fabrics that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, creating garments that appeared ordinary to most observers, but revealed hidden properties to those who knew how to look. His workshop contained looms that operated without human intervention, their shuttles moving in patterns that seemed to follow mathematical principles unknown to conventional geometry. The family's client list had grown to include railroad barons, steel magnates, and politicians whose rise to power coincided suspiciously with their acquisition of Weaver textiles. President McKinley himself wore a Weaver-crafted vest beneath his formal attire, a garment that allegedly provided protection against both physical harm and political scandal. The irony was not lost on Marcus when McKinley was assassinated in 1901, the vest having been deliberately woven with a single flaw, a microscopic gap in its protective weave that aligned perfectly with Leon Czolgosz's bullet. This was the new reality of Weaver influence. They no longer merely responded to desperate clients seeking supernatural aid. They had become puppet masters, orchestrating the rise and fall of America's most powerful figures through carefully crafted textiles that carried hidden costs and predetermined expiration dates. The family's accounting methods had evolved as well. Where Ezekiel had once maintained simple ledgers tracking debts and payments, his descendants now operated what could only be described as a metaphysical banking system. Deep beneath their expanded compound, in chambers that existed partially outside normal space-time, massive looms worked continuously, weaving threads of human essence into tapestries that mapped the spiritual debts of an entire nation. Each thread represented a life touched by Weaver influence. Red threads indicated active debts, their intensity corresponding to the magnitude of what was owed. Golden threads marked those whose accounts had been settled, though settlement rarely meant freedom. Black threads, the most numerous, represented souls that had been fully claimed, their essence permanently woven into the family's growing power base. The most disturbing development was the appearance of silver threads, which began manifesting around 1903. These represented something new in the Weaver legacy. Individuals who had never directly sought the family's services, but had been indirectly influenced through proximity to Weaver clients. A businessman who profited from a deal with someone wearing Weaver clothing, a politician who benefited from legislation passed by a Weaver-influenced senator, a soldier whose life was saved by equipment manufactured in a factory owned by a Weaver client. The threads of influence were spreading exponentially, creating a web of supernatural debt that encompassed thousands of Americans who had no idea they were connected to forces beyond their understanding. Marcus realized with both excitement and dread that his family was approaching a tipping point where their influence would become self-sustaining, no longer requiring active cultivation, but growing through the natural interconnectedness of human society. The workshop itself had undergone radical transformation. What had once been a modest collection of supernatural looms now resembled something between a cathedral and a machine. The main weaving hall stretched impossibly far in all directions, its walls lined with looms of every conceivable design, and some that seemed to exist in defiance of physical law. Some operated in complete silence, their shuttles moving through space without touching their frames. Others produced sounds that weren't quite music, but affected listeners in profound ways, inducing visions, memories, or emotional states that could last for days. The most significant addition was the prophecy loom, a massive construction that occupied the hall's center. Unlike other looms that created physical textiles, this device wove possibilities themselves, creating tapestries that depicted potential futures. Marcus spent hours studying these ever-changing images, watching threads shift and realign as decisions were made across the country. The loom showed him which investments would succeed, which politicians would rise, which disasters could be prevented or encouraged. But the visions came with a price. Extended exposure to the prophecy loom's output caused what the family termed temporal displacement. Marcus would occasionally find himself experiencing memories that hadn't happened yet, or remembering conversations with people who wouldn't be born for decades. His younger siblings exhibited similar symptoms, though each manifested differently. His sister Charlotte aged backward on certain days, becoming physically younger while retaining her adult memories. His brother Thomas occasionally existed in multiple locations simultaneously, his consciousness split between different versions of reality. The family's influence on American industry became increasingly sophisticated. Rather than simply providing supernatural textiles to individual clients, they began weaving their products into the infrastructure of entire industries. Cotton mills throughout the South processed weaver fibers mixed with ordinary cotton, creating fabrics that carried subtle influences. Workers in these mills reported unusual dreams, often featuring similar imagery of vast looms and shadowy figures offering bargains. Many left their jobs to seek out the Weaver family directly, having been psychologically prepared through months of exposure to trace amounts of supernatural material. Railroad companies unknowingly used Weaver textiles in their passenger car upholstery. Travelers who spent extended time on these trains arrived at their destinations subtly changed, more susceptible to suggestion, and prone to making decisions that ultimately benefited Weaver interests. Hotels in major cities featured Weaver-influenced carpets and draperies, creating environments where business deals were more likely to favor clients who served the family's long-term goals. The Spanish-American War provided the Weavers with their first opportunity to influence military affairs on a large scale. Through carefully placed contacts in the War Department, they arranged for certain units to receive uniforms incorporating Weaver fibers. These soldiers displayed remarkable courage and effectiveness in battle, but also began experiencing shared dreams of conquest and expansion that extended far beyond the current conflict. Military leaders who wore Weaver-influenced dress uniforms found themselves inexplicably drawn to more aggressive foreign policies, setting the stage for America's emergence as a global imperial power. But the family's greatest achievement during this period was the creation of what Marcus termed the generational loom. This device didn't weave physical materials at all, but instead worked with the threads of heredity and bloodline. By incorporating genetic material from their clients, hair, blood, or more intimate samples, the loom could influence not just the individual who had made a bargain with the weavers, but their descendants as well. Children born to parents who had utilized weaver services displayed unusual characteristics. Enhanced intelligence was common, but so was a peculiar form of moral flexibility that made them ideal candidates for positions requiring ethical compromise. Many became lawyers, politicians, or business leaders, unconsciously serving weaver interests while believing they were pursuing their own ambitions. The most disturbing cases involved children who seemed to inherit specific skills or knowledge that their parents had gained through weaver bargains. A senator who had received the gift of persuasive speech through a weaver textile found his son displaying similar abilities from an early age, despite never being exposed to supernatural influences. A businessman whose fortune had been built on weaver-enhanced intuition watched his daughter demonstrate an almost supernatural understanding of financial markets before she was old enough to read. These inherited traits came with inherited debts. The generational loom automatically registered each affected child in the family's accounts, their spiritual obligations predetermined by their parents' choices. Marcus realized he was creating a permanent class of Americans who would serve weaver interests across multiple generations, their descendants bound to the family's will through supernatural contracts they had never consciously accepted. The workshop's expansion had also attracted attention from entities that existed beyond the human world. The weaver's original benefactors, the shadowy forces that had first empowered Ezekiel, were no longer the family's only supernatural contacts. The decades of reality-altering work had torn small rifts in the fabric of existence itself, creating opportunities for other beings to establish footholds in the physical world. Some of these new entities were benevolent, or at least neutral. They offered knowledge, alternative techniques, or access to materials that existed only in parallel dimensions. But others were predatory, seeking to exploit the weaver's growing power for their own purposes. Marcus found himself negotiating increasingly complex agreements with beings whose true nature he could barely comprehend, trading portions of human reality for access to ever more powerful supernatural capabilities. The family compound reflected these otherworldly influences. Rooms existed that were larger inside than outside, their dimensions shifting based on the observer's intentions. Corridors led to destinations that changed depending on the time of day or the walker's emotional state. The basement levels extended impossibly deep, connecting to cavern systems that existed partially in other worlds entirely. Visitors to the compound, the few who were permitted entry, reported disturbing experiences. Time moved differently in various rooms, with some chambers where conversations lasted hours, occurring simultaneously with brief moments in adjacent spaces. Mirrors reflected not just the viewer's appearance, but their potential futures, showing what they might become if they accepted weaver services. Gardens grew plants that existed nowhere else on Earth, their flowers blooming in colors that had no names and fruits that tasted like memories. The family itself was changing as well. Extended exposure to supernatural forces had begun altering their physical forms in subtle but significant ways. Their eyes reflected light differently, sometimes appearing to glow with inner fire in dim lighting. Their shadows moved independently, occasionally gesturing or pointing in directions their bodies weren't facing. Most unsettling, they began aging at different rates, with some family members appearing younger each year while others aged rapidly, as if their lifespans were being redistributed according to some cosmic accounting system. Marcus's wife, Sarah, who had married into the family in 1899, documented these changes in a private journal that would later be discovered by researchers attempting to understand the Weaver legacy. Her entries described a gradual transformation, not just of her husband and his relatives, but of herself as well. She wrote of dreams that felt more real than waking life, of conversations with beings that spoke in languages that bypassed the ears and communicated directly with the mind, of growing awareness that her marriage had bound her to forces that existed beyond human comprehension. By 1905, Sarah was participating directly in the family's supernatural practices, her own innate abilities awakened through constant exposure to otherworldly influences. She developed a talent for reading the spiritual debts carried by individuals, able to determine at a glance whether someone had been touched by supernatural forces and to what degree. This ability proved invaluable as the family's client base expanded and the need to track their growing network of influenced individuals became critical. The most significant development during this period was the creation of the first Weaver repositories, hidden locations throughout the United States where the family stored both physical textiles and more abstract supernatural assets. These facilities appeared to be ordinary warehouses or storage buildings, but their interiors existed in carefully controlled pocket dimensions where the normal laws of physics were suspended. Each repository served as both storage facility and recruitment center. Individuals who had been identified as potential Weaver clients through the family's expanding surveillance network would find themselves inexplicably drawn to these locations. Once inside, they would encounter displays of seemingly ordinary textiles that triggered powerful psychological responses, awakening desires for power, wealth, or abilities they had never consciously acknowledged. The repositories operated automatically, staffed by individuals who had been so thoroughly influenced by Weaver textiles that they functioned as extensions of the family's will rather than independent beings. These attendants could identify each visitor's deepest needs and present exactly the right combination of supernatural textiles to create binding agreements, all without requiring direct Weaver family involvement. But perhaps the most ominous development was the appearance of what Marcus termed echo weavers. These were individuals, always children or young adults, who had been so profoundly affected by exposure to Weaver textiles that they began developing supernatural abilities independently. Unlike the family members, whose powers were inherited and carefully cultivated, echo weavers represented something new and potentially uncontrollable. The first confirmed case appeared in Chicago in 1906. A 12-year-old girl whose father had purchased a Weaver pocket watch began creating small textiles that displayed impossible properties. Her embroidery seemed to move when observed peripherally, and clothing she mended would repair itself if damaged again. More disturbing, she claimed to hear voices speaking through her needle and thread, providing instructions for increasingly complex projects that she couldn't possibly understand. Similar cases began appearing across the country, always connected to individuals who had been exposed to Weaver influences but never directly served by the family. These echo weavers posed both an opportunity and a threat. Their abilities could be cultivated and directed to serve family interests, but their independence made them unpredictable. Some sought out the Weaver family directly, drawn by instincts they couldn't explain. Others tried to use their abilities for personal gain, often with catastrophic results that threatened to expose the supernatural world to public scrutiny. Marcus realized that his family had reached a critical juncture. Their influence had grown beyond their ability to directly control, creating ripple effects that were generating new supernatural phenomena across America. The choice facing them was whether to attempt to contain and control these developments or to embrace the chaos and use it to accelerate their transformation of American society. The decision would ultimately determine not just the fate of the Weaver family, but the future of supernatural influence in the New World. As 1910 approached, Marcus stood in his impossible workshop, surrounded by looms that wove reality itself, knowing that the next decade would either see his family ascend to heights of power that no human bloodline had ever achieved, or witness the collapse of everything they had built as the forces they had unleashed spiraled beyond any possibility of control. As the 20th century dawned, the Weaver family had become something far more sinister than simple textile merchants. What began with Ezekiel's supernatural looms had evolved into an intricate web of metaphysical manipulation that stretched across dimensions themselves. The family no longer merely influenced events. They were rewriting the fundamental laws of reality, one thread at a time. By 1903, the Weavers had established what they called the temporal workshops, hidden facilities scattered throughout the Kentucky mountains, where time itself became their raw material. Unlike their earlier looms that manipulated probability and human essence, these new devices could harvest actual moments from the past and future, weaving them into present reality. Witnesses described seeing the workshops flicker between different time periods, with the same building appearing simultaneously as a rustic cabin and a gleaming industrial complex depending on the viewer's angle. The process was horrifyingly precise. Family members would descend into underground chambers where massive looms stretched across caverns, their threads composed of crystallized time, strands that glowed with an inner light and hummed with the voices of countless moments. The Weavers discovered they could extract pivotal seconds from history, those crucial instants where decisions shaped destinies, and reweave them into new patterns. A moment of hesitation that prevented a murder could be removed and replaced with one of resolve. A flash of inspiration that led to an invention could be stolen and implanted elsewhere. Local historians began noticing disturbing inconsistencies in regional records. Events that multiple witnesses remembered differently, dates that shifted in official documents, and entire family lineages that seemed to have been retroactively altered. The Weavers weren't just changing the present, they were editing history itself. Most unsettling were the temporal echoes, fragments of erased timelines that occasionally surfaced like ghosts. Residents would sometimes encounter people who claimed to be their neighbors but possessed completely different life stories, or would find photographs in their homes showing family members who had never existed. the family's power attracted increasingly dangerous attention from entities that existed outside normal time. These beings, which the weavers referred to only as the unravelers, began manifesting near the workshops. Unlike the supernatural entities the family had previously dealt with, the unravelers seemed genuinely hostile to the weavers' activities. They appeared as voids in reality, spaces where time itself had been damaged beyond repair, and their presence caused temporal anomalies that even the weavers couldn't control. The first major incident occurred in 1907 when Martha Weaver attempted to harvest a particularly potent moment from the Civil War, the instant when a Confederate general decided to retreat rather than attack. The extraction process went catastrophically wrong. The workshop erupted in what witnesses described as a temporal storm, with past and future colliding in the present. For 3 days, the surrounding area experienced random time distortions. Settlers aged decades in minutes, then reverted to children. Animals were born already dead, having lived their entire lives in reverse. Most disturbing were the temporal refugees, people from different time periods who were pulled into the present and couldn't return to their own eras. Martha herself became trapped in what the family termed a time loop, endlessly reliving the same 17 minutes while aging normally. By the time other family members managed to extract her, she had experienced those minutes over 3,000 times, emerging psychologically shattered but possessing an uncanny ability to predict immediate future events with perfect accuracy. She spent her remaining years documenting these predictions in journals written in her own blood, claiming that ink from any other source would fade before the prophecies could be fulfilled. The incident forced the weavers to develop new safety protocols, but it also revealed the true scope of their abilities. They realized they could create temporal anchors, fixed points in time that remained stable even when surrounding events were altered. This discovery led to their most ambitious project yet, the construction of the Kronos Loom, a device so massive it required an entire mountain to house it. The Kronos Loom was built inside Mount Harrow, a peak the weavers had purchased through a series of shell companies and false identities. Over the course of 5 years, they hollowed out the mountain's interior, creating a chamber that existed partially outside normal space-time. The loom itself defied conventional description. Its frame was constructed from petrified wood harvested from trees that had died in multiple timelines, while its threads were spun from the crystallized dreams of prophets and madmen. The device's purpose was nothing less than the creation of alternate histories, entire timelines that existed parallel to reality but could be accessed and manipulated by those who knew the proper techniques. The weavers began experimenting with creating pocket dimensions where different versions of historical events had occurred. In one, the Civil War had never ended, with ghost armies still fighting battles across spectral battlefields. In another, the Industrial Revolution had been replaced by an age of biological engineering where cities were grown rather than built. These alternate histories weren't merely academic exercises. The weavers discovered they could harvest resources from these parallel timelines and import them into reality. Coal from a dimension where the Earth's geology had developed differently, technologies from timelines where scientific advancement had taken alternate paths, and most disturbing of all, people from realities where different choices had created entirely different personalities and capabilities. The process of managing these alternate histories required a new generation of weavers with enhanced abilities. Children born after 1910 displayed mutations that went far beyond the physical changes seen in earlier generations. These new weavers possessed what the family called temporal sight, the ability to perceive multiple timelines simultaneously. They could see the ghostly outlines of alternate versions of people and events, allowing them to navigate between different realities with increasing ease. However, this enhanced perception came with severe psychological costs. The newer weavers struggled to maintain coherent identities, often believing they were simultaneously living multiple lives across different timelines. Family records from this period described children who would respond to names they had never been given, claiming to remember events that had occurred in parallel realities. Some developed multiple temporal personality disorder, cycling between different versions of themselves from various timelines throughout the day. The family's expansion into temporal manipulation also attracted attention from government agencies that were beginning to notice the impossible patterns surrounding Weaver activities. In 1912, a federal investigation team arrived in eastern Kentucky to investigate reports of chronological irregularities in the region. The team consisted of scientists, military officers, and several individuals whose credentials were so heavily classified that even their names were redacted from official records. The Weavers' response to this investigation demonstrated the full extent of their evolved capabilities. Rather than hide their activities or eliminate the investigators, they chose a more elegant solution. They simply edited the investigators out of history. Using the Chronos loom, they identified the crucial moments that had led to each investigator's assignment to the case and systematically unraveled them. One investigator's expertise in temporal anomalies was erased by preventing his childhood encounter with a mysterious artifact. Another's military career was redirected by altering a single conversation with a recruiting officer. Within weeks, the investigation was quietly abandoned as the federal agents found themselves reassigned to completely different cases, with no memory of why they had originally been interested in Kentucky. This successful manipulation of federal authorities marked a turning point in the Weavers' evolution. They realized that their abilities had grown beyond what any single family could safely manage. The sheer complexity of maintaining multiple timelines while avoiding paradoxes required a level of coordination that strained even their enhanced capabilities. The solution came from an unexpected source, the Unravelers themselves. During a particularly dangerous experiment in 1915, young Solomon Weaver made contact with one of the Unravelers in a way that didn't result in temporal catastrophe. Through a process he later described as negotiating with living entropy, he discovered that the Unravelers weren't necessarily hostile to the Weaver's activities. They were, in fact, temporal maintenance entities, beings whose purpose was to repair damage to the fabric of time itself. The Unravelers' concern wasn't that the Weavers were manipulating time. It was that they were doing so without proper understanding of the cosmic consequences. Each alteration to history created ripple effects that extended far beyond Earth, affecting the development of civilizations on distant worlds and even influencing the evolution of fundamental physical laws in other dimensions. The Weavers' activities were approaching a threshold where their localized manipulations could cascade into universe-altering catastrophes. This revelation led to the establishment of what the family called the Temporal Accord, a complex agreement between the Weavers and the Unravelers that would govern all future chronological manipulations. The terms of this agreement were written in a language that existed outside normal time, with each word existing simultaneously in past, present, and future tenses. The document itself was inscribed on sheets of crystallized spacetime that could only be read by beings capable of perceiving multiple temporal dimensions simultaneously. Under the Accord, the Weavers agreed to limit their temporal manipulations to their immediate geographical region and to avoid alterations that could affect global historical development. In exchange, the Unravelers would provide them with advanced temporal technology and knowledge of cosmic chronological principles. Most importantly, the Unravelers would teach the Weavers how to create temporal stable zones, areas where time flowed normally, regardless of external manipulations. The implementation of the Temporal Accord required the Weavers to restructure their entire operation. They established the Council of Hours, a governing body consisting of representatives from different temporal periods within the family's history. Past, present, and future, Weavers would meet in specially constructed chambers where linear time was suspended, allowing them to coordinate activities across multiple decades simultaneously. The Council's first major decision was the creation of the Weaver Chronological Protocols, a set of rules governing temporal manipulation that would prevent paradoxes and minimize cosmic disruption. These protocols were enforced by a new class of family members called Temporal Wardens, individuals who had been specially trained to monitor timeline integrity and intervene when necessary to prevent chronological catastrophes. The Temporal Wardens possessed abilities that surpassed even the enhanced Weavers of the previous generation. They could exist simultaneously in multiple timelines, maintaining conscious awareness across different versions of reality. Their bodies were partially phased out of normal time, making them appear translucent and causing them to age at dramatically reduced rates. Some wardens from this period were still active well into the 21st century, despite being born in the early 1900s. However, the establishment of the Temporal Accord also revealed the true scope of the forces the Weavers had been manipulating. The Unravelers weren't the only entities interested in temporal stability. Through their expanded cosmic awareness, the Weavers discovered the existence of the Chronos hierarchy, a vast network of beings and civilizations that existed across multiple dimensions and time periods, all working to maintain the integrity of what they called the universal timeline. The Weavers learned that their activities had attracted attention from entities so far beyond human comprehension that direct contact would have been impossible. These beings communicated through the Unravelers, expressing concern that the Weavers' growing power could eventually threaten the stability of reality itself across multiple universes. The family found themselves in the position of being simultaneously the most powerful temporal manipulators on Earth and among the most closely monitored entities in the cosmos. This cosmic attention brought both opportunities and restrictions. The Weavers gained access to temporal technologies that allowed them to create pocket universes, manipulate the flow of causality, and even influence the development of physical laws within localized regions. However, they also found themselves bound by cosmic regulations that limited how they could use these abilities. The most significant restriction was the causality preservation mandate, which required the weavers to ensure that any temporal manipulations they performed would ultimately result in a timeline that remained compatible with the broader cosmic order. This meant that while they could alter local events, they had to do so in ways that wouldn't prevent the occurrence of cosmically significant developments, such as the evolution of other intelligent species or the formation of crucial stellar phenomena. By 1920, the Weaver family had evolved into something that barely resembled their original human form. They had become temporal entities, beings who existed across multiple time periods simultaneously while maintaining their base of operations in early 20th century Kentucky. Their influence extended far beyond Earth, affecting the development of civilizations in distant galaxies and even influencing the formation of alternate universes. Yet for all their cosmic power, the Weavers remained bound to their original mission of creating and controlling through weaving. They had simply expanded their definition of fabric to include the very structure of reality itself. Every thread they wove now connected not just different locations or people, but different possibilities, different timelines, different versions of existence itself. The question that haunted the family as they entered the 1920s was whether they had achieved ultimate mastery over reality or had become prisoners of forces so vast and complex that their every action was predetermined by cosmic necessity. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Weaver family had transcended their humble Appalachian origins to become something far more sinister and encompassing. What began as a modest operation with supernatural looms in a Kentucky hollow had metastasized into a vast network of influence that stretched across continents and dimensions. The family's mastery over temporal manipulation and reality alteration had reached a crescendo that would forever change the fabric of existence itself. The Great Convergence, as it came to be known in the family's encrypted records, began in 1902 when Ezekiel's great-grandson, Thaddeus Weaver, discovered something that would push their capabilities beyond anything previously imagined. While exploring the deepest chambers beneath the original homestead, Thaddeus uncovered what appeared to be the remnants of an ancient civilization. The walls were covered in symbols that bore an uncanny resemblance to the patterns their looms had been weaving for decades, suggesting that the Weaver family's power was not an anomaly, but part of a much larger cosmic design. These symbols, when properly interpreted through the lens of their accumulated knowledge, revealed the existence of what they termed the prime loom. This was not a physical device, but rather a conceptual framework that governed the fundamental structure of reality across all dimensions and timelines. The revelation was staggering in its implications. Every thread their family had ever woven, every reality they had altered, every timeline they had manipulated, had been part of a vast tapestry that was itself being woven by forces beyond human comprehension. The discovery triggered what the family called the awakening. Thaddeus and his siblings began experiencing visions of impossible scope and clarity. They could perceive not just alternate timelines, but the underlying mathematical principles that governed existence itself. They witnessed the birth and death of entire universes, saw civilizations rise and fall across dimensions, and understood their role in a cosmic hierarchy that extended far beyond their earthly concerns. With this newfound understanding came unprecedented power. The family's looms evolved once again, becoming instruments capable of weaving not just individual realities, but entire dimensional frameworks. They created what they called pocket universes, small but complete realities that existed within the folds of normal space-time, thus served as testing grounds for their increasingly ambitious experiments and as repositories for the vast knowledge they were accumulating. The weavers discovered that consciousness itself was a form of thread that could be manipulated and rewoven. They began experimenting with what they termed soul weaving, the practice of extracting, modifying, and reinstalling the essential essence of living beings. Their first subjects were volunteers from their network of servants and allies, individuals whose loyalty to the family bordered on religious devotion. The results were extraordinary. They could enhance intelligence, grant supernatural abilities, and even achieve a form of immortality by weaving souls into more durable patterns. However, these experiments revealed a disturbing truth about the nature of existence. Consciousness, they learned, was not an emergent property of complex matter, but rather a fundamental force that existed independently of physical form. Every manipulation they performed, every soul they rewove, created ripples that extended far beyond their immediate sphere of influence. They were not simply altering individual lives, but reshaping the very nature of consciousness across multiple dimensions. The family's growing power attracted the attention of entities that existed on scales they could barely comprehend. These beings, which the weavers referred to as the architects, were the original creators of the cosmic framework within which all realities existed. The architects had been watching the Weaver family's development with interest, recognizing in them a species that had stumbled upon principles that typically required millions of years of evolution to understand. The first contact with the architects occurred during a routine temporal manipulation experiment in 1908. Thaddeus was attempting to create a stable time loop that would allow for the extraction of resources from alternate timelines when the fabric of reality around him began to shift in ways that defied even his advanced understanding. The air itself seemed to become conscious, forming patterns of light and sound that conveyed meaning directly to his mind. The communication was overwhelming in its complexity. The architects existed as pure information, consciousness, without physical form that could manipulate reality through thought alone. They explained that the Weaver family's activities had reached a critical threshold. Their manipulations were beginning to affect the stability of the cosmic framework itself, threatening to unravel not just individual realities, but the entire structure that supported existence across all dimensions. The revelation was terrifying. The family realized that their pursuit of power had brought them to the edge of triggering what the architects called the Great Unraveling, a cascade failure that would reduce all of existence to primordial chaos. Every reality they had created, every timeline they had altered, every soul they had rewoven, was connected to this vast web of cause and effect that extended throughout the cosmic framework. The architects presented the weavers with a choice. They could continue their current path and risk destroying everything that had ever existed, or they could accept a new role as cosmic gardeners, using their abilities to maintain and repair the damage they had already caused. The decision was not merely a matter of family survival, but of universal preservation. After intense deliberation, the family chose to accept the architect's offer. This decision marked the beginning of what they called the Great Transformation. Each member of the Weaver bloodline underwent a process that fundamentally altered their nature. They retained their individual consciousness, but became part of a larger collective intelligence that spanned multiple dimensions. Their physical forms became optional, existing as patterns of organized energy that could manifest in whatever form was required for their duties. Their new role as cosmic gardeners required them to monitor and maintain the stability of reality across countless dimensions. They became the guardians of the cosmic framework, working to prevent the kind of cascade failures that their own activities had nearly triggered. This work involved not just technical manipulation of reality, but also the subtle guidance of civilizations and species that were approaching their own critical thresholds of development. The family's earthly operations continued, but with a vastly different purpose. Their business empire became a cover for their cosmic activities, providing them with the resources and influence needed to monitor and influence human development. They established research facilities that appeared to be studying mundane subjects, but were actually investigating the intersection between human consciousness and cosmic principles. Their most significant discovery during this period was the existence of what they termed nexus points, locations where the barriers between dimensions were naturally thin. These points served as critical junctions in the cosmic framework, and their stability was essential for maintaining the integrity of reality itself. The family established secret facilities at these locations, disguised as everything from research stations to religious retreats, where they could monitor and maintain these crucial intersections. The Weavers also discovered that certain bloodlines among humanity carried genetic markers that made them naturally sensitive to dimensional fluctuations. These individuals, whom they called threads, possessed the potential to develop abilities similar to their own if properly trained and guided. The family began a careful program of identification and cultivation of these bloodlines, working across generations to prepare humanity for its eventual role in the cosmic framework. This work required unprecedented levels of subtlety and patience. The family learned to think in terms of centuries rather than decades, planning interventions that would unfold across multiple generations. They influenced everything from scientific discoveries to artistic movements, guiding human development along paths that would eventually lead to a species capable of understanding and participating in cosmic maintenance. The scope of their influence became truly staggering. They were involved in the establishment of major universities, the funding of crucial scientific research, and the preservation of knowledge during periods of social upheaval. Their agents worked within governments, religious organizations, and cultural institutions, always working to nudge humanity toward greater understanding of the fundamental nature of reality. Yet despite their cosmic responsibilities, the family never forgot their Appalachian origins. The original homestead remained their primary base of operations, its humble exterior concealing chambers that existed partially outside normal space-time. The old looms were preserved as sacred relics, reminders of their journey from simple weavers to cosmic gardeners. The mountains themselves had been transformed by their presence, becoming a nexus point of particular importance, where the barriers between dimensions were maintained through their constant vigilance. The local population of Appalachia began to exhibit subtle changes over the generations. Those who lived near the Weaver territory developed enhanced intuition and occasional glimpses of alternate realities. Children born in the region showed unusual abilities, though these were carefully monitored and guided by the family's agents. The entire area became a testing ground for the integration of human consciousness with cosmic principles. As the 20th century progressed, the Weavers faced new challenges. The rapid advancement of human technology began to create its own disruptions in the cosmic framework. Nuclear weapons, in particular, posed a significant threat as they could create tears in the fabric of reality that were difficult to repair. The family worked tirelessly to prevent the worst outcomes, sometimes intervening directly in historical events to prevent catastrophic damage to the cosmic framework. Their influence extended into the realm of popular culture as well. They recognized that stories and myths played a crucial role in preparing human consciousness for expanded awareness of reality's true nature. They subtly influenced the creation of science fiction literature, fantasy novels, and films that gradually introduced concepts of alternate dimensions, time travel, and cosmic consciousness to the general population. The family's transformation from humble weavers to cosmic gardeners represented more than just an increase in power or responsibility. It marked a fundamental shift in the nature of human consciousness itself. Through their work, they were not just maintaining the cosmic framework, but actively participating in its evolution. They had become bridges between the purely human and the truly cosmic, serving as interpreters and guides for a species that was slowly awakening to its place in a vast and interconnected universe. The implications of their transformation would continue to unfold throughout the 20th century and beyond, as humanity itself began to approach the threshold of cosmic awareness that the Weaver family had crossed generations earlier. The year 1963 marked a turning point in the Weaver legacy, though few understood its significance at the time. The Cuban Missile Crisis had the world teetering on the edge of nuclear war, but deep within their interdimensional sanctum, the Weavers faced a crisis of an entirely different magnitude. The cosmic entities they had allied with for over a century were beginning to fragment, their ancient unity dissolving into factions with incompatible visions for reality itself. Ezekiel's great-great-grandson, Marcus Weaver, had inherited not just the family's supernatural abilities, but also their growing burden of cosmic responsibility. Unlike his ancestors, who had operated from the shadows of Kentucky Hollows, Marcus found himself managing temporal disruptions across multiple realities, while simultaneously maintaining the family's earthly enterprises. The Weaver textile empire now spanned 43 countries, their products woven with such subtle enchantments that world leaders unknowingly wore garments that influenced their decision-making processes. But the real power lay in what the family called the deep looms, mechanical constructs that existed partially in our dimension and partially in spaces between realities. These devices had evolved far beyond their original purpose of creating supernatural textiles. By 1963, They were weaving the very fabric of probability, adjusting the likelihood of events across entire continents. The assassination of President Kennedy, the rise of the Beatles, the escalation in Vietnam, each of these pivotal moments carried threads that traced back to decisions made in the Weaver sanctuaries. The crisis began when the Unravelers, those cosmic entities obsessed with entropy and dissolution, declared their intention to accelerate the breakdown of dimensional barriers. Their argument was seductively simple. If all realities collapsed into one chaotic mass, the suffering inherent in existence would finally end. No more parallel versions of the same tragedies playing out across infinite variations. No more loops of historical pain repeating endlessly through different timelines. Just blessed, final entropy. The architects, by contrast, sought to impose absolute order across all dimensions. They envisioned a multiverse where every variable was controlled, every outcome predetermined, every possibility carefully managed. Under their system, free will would become obsolete, but so would uncertainty, pain, and the random cruelties that plagued conscious beings across all realities. Marcus found himself caught between these extremes, inheriting his family's role as mediators in a cosmic conflict that threatened to tear apart the fundamental structure of existence. The temporal and universal accord that his ancestors had helped establish was crumbling, its carefully negotiated treaties meaningless in the face of such ideological division. The first sign of the escalating crisis manifested in what historians would later call the Great Anomaly of 1964. Across the American South, witnesses reported seeing the same mountain appear in multiple locations simultaneously. Pilots flying over Kentucky claimed to observe Appalachian peaks that existed in their instruments but cast no shadows. Photographers discovered that certain landscapes appeared differently in pictures than they had to the naked eye, as if the camera was capturing images from adjacent realities. The Weaver family understood what was happening. The dimensional barriers were becoming permeable, allowing glimpses of parallel worlds to bleed through into baseline reality. In some of these adjacent dimensions, the Civil War had never ended. In others, European colonization of the Americas had failed entirely. The overlapping of these realities created pockets of temporal confusion where cause and effect operated according to different rules. Marcus realized that maintaining the balance would require unprecedented cooperation between the cosmic factions. Working through intermediaries, beings that existed as living concepts rather than physical entities, he proposed a radical solution. Instead of choosing between absolute order and absolute chaos, why not create a controlled form of managed entropy? Allow enough randomness to preserve free will and growth, but within parameters that prevented total collapse. The negotiations took place in a space that existed between seconds, in the pause between one moment and the next. Representatives of each faction manifested as geometric patterns of living light, their communications taking the form of mathematical equations that rewrote themselves as they were observed. Marcus, despite being merely human, found himself serving as translator between incomprehensible intelligences whose thoughts operated on scales of time and space that strained the limits of mortal comprehension. During these cosmic negotiations, the earthly operations of the Weaver Empire continued under the management of Marcus's sister, Helena. Where Marcus had inherited their father's talent for dimensional manipulation, Helena possessed an intuitive understanding of human psychology that made her invaluable in managing their terrestrial interests. She could observe a person for mere minutes and understand exactly what threads of influence would be most effective in shaping their behavior. Helena's innovations transformed the family business in ways that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. Instead of simply creating enchanted textiles, she began weaving psychological patterns directly into the social fabric of human civilization. Fashion trends that swept across continents carried subtle behavioral modifications. The rise of youth counterculture in the 1960s, the explosion of mass media, the growing interconnectedness of global communication, all of these cultural shifts bore the invisible influence of Helena's work. Her masterpiece was what she called the empathy web, a network of interconnected influences designed to gradually increase human capacity for understanding across cultural and ideological boundaries. The peace movements, civil rights activism, and growing environmental awareness of the 1960s were all amplified by threads woven into everything from protest banners to television broadcasting equipment. Helena believed that if humanity could develop greater empathy for one another, they might eventually prove worthy partners in managing cosmic responsibilities rather than merely subjects to be protected or controlled. But the empathy web came with an unexpected cost. As human consciousness became more interconnected, it also became more susceptible to influence from the cosmic entities themselves. People began reporting shared dreams featuring impossible geometries and incomprehensible messages. Musicians claimed their songs were being influenced by melodies heard in these dreams. Scientists made breakthrough discoveries after receiving inspiration from visions they couldn't rationally explain. The boundary between human consciousness and cosmic awareness was thinning, creating opportunities, but also unprecedented dangers. If humanity wasn't ready for direct contact with entities that existed beyond normal space and time, the results could be catastrophic. Mass psychosis, reality breaks, or worse, the complete dissolution of human identity into something unrecognizably alien. Marcus found himself racing against time to complete the cosmic negotiations before the psychological effects of Helena's work reached a critical threshold. The unravelers were exploiting the situation, whispering directly into human minds through the enhanced connectivity Helena had created. Their message was seductive in its simplicity. Embrace the chaos, let go of the burden of individual consciousness, dissolve into the peaceful void where suffering cannot exist. The architects, meanwhile, were attempting to use the same network to impose their vision of absolute order. Individuals under their influence began displaying eerily similar behavioral patterns, their creativity and spontaneity gradually replaced by algorithmic predictability. They remained functional, even highly efficient, but something essentially human was being systematically erased from their personalities. The crisis reached its peak during the summer of 1967, which historians remember as the Summer of Love, but which Marcus would always think of as the summer of almost ending. The dimensional barriers became so thin that parallel versions of major cities began overlapping with their baseline reality counterparts. In San Francisco, protesters marched through streets that existed in 3 different timelines simultaneously. Some pedestrians found themselves walking past buildings that had been demolished decades earlier in their reality, but still stood in adjacent dimensions. The Weaver family's response was both desperate and ingenious. Marcus and Helena worked together to create what they called the stabilization tapestry, a massive textile construct that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Unlike their ancestors' work, which had focused on creating localized effects, the stabilization tapestry was designed to reinforce the boundaries between realities while still allowing controlled interaction between dimensions. The weaving of this cosmic fabric required sacrifices that would have horrified earlier generations of weavers. Helena volunteered to serve as a living anchor point, allowing her consciousness to be partially dispersed across multiple realities to serve as a stabilizing influence. She would remain aware and functional in baseline reality, but portions of her psyche would exist permanently in adjacent dimensions, monitoring and adjusting the fabric of existence itself. Marcus, meanwhile, accepted a role as permanent mediator between the cosmic factions. His human perspective, limited as it was, proved valuable precisely because of its limitations. The cosmic entities thought in terms of geological ages and universal cycles, but Marcus could focus on the immediate needs of individual conscious beings. His solutions might not be elegant from a cosmic perspective, but they were practical and achievable. The stabilization tapestry took 3 years to complete, its creation requiring the coordinated efforts of Weaver family members across 17 different dimensions. The process was exhausting and dangerous, with several family members becoming permanently displaced in realities where the fundamental laws of physics operated differently than they expected. But when it was finally activated in 1970, the results were immediately apparent. The dimensional bleeds stopped. The overlapping realities separated cleanly, each returning to its proper space in the cosmic order. The enhanced human consciousness network that Helena had created remained functional, but with built-in safeguards that prevented direct manipulation by cosmic entities. Humanity retained its expanded capacity for empathy and connection, but also preserved its essential independence and free will. The cosmic factions, faced with the success of the Weaver's compromise solution, agreed to a new form of the temporal and universal accord. Instead of the rigid, hierarchical structure that had previously governed interdimensional relations, the new agreement established a more flexible system of checks and balances. The unravelers were permitted to introduce controlled amounts of entropy to prevent stagnation, while the architects could implement organizational structures to prevent total chaos. The weavers and other mediating entities would monitor the balance and intervene when necessary to prevent either extreme from gaining too much influence. But the true cost of this cosmic diplomacy only became apparent in the following decades. The Weaver family had become so intertwined with the fundamental structure of reality that they could no longer fully exist as ordinary humans. Marcus aged at a rate determined by dimensional time rather than earthly time, sometimes appearing to grow older rapidly, other times remaining unchanged for years at a stretch. Helena existed simultaneously across multiple realities, her personality shifting subtly depending on which dimensional aspect was most prominent at any given moment. Their children, when they had them, were born with abilities that defied classification. Some could perceive the emotional states of people in adjacent realities. Others could manipulate probability on a local scale, causing unlikely but beneficial coincidences to occur around them with suspicious frequency. A few developed the ability to temporarily step outside of time entirely, experiencing hours or days in the space between seconds. These abilities made the younger generation of weavers invaluable as agents of cosmic stability, but they also isolated them from normal human experience. They attended schools where they had to constantly monitor their own behavior to avoid accidentally revealing their true nature. They formed relationships with people who could never fully understand the weight of responsibility they carried or the constant awareness of multiple realities that colored their every perception. The family's earthly business empire continued to prosper, but it had become merely a front for their true work as cosmic mediators. Weaver Industries produced everything from computer processors to space shuttle components, but their real products were stability, balance, and the subtle maintenance of the barriers between order and chaos. By the 1980s, the Weaver family had established monitoring stations in key locations around the globe, places where the dimensional barriers were naturally thin and required constant surveillance. These facilities appeared to be research centers or manufacturing plants, but their true purpose was to detect and respond to cosmic anomalies before they could affect baseline reality. The work was never ending and often thankless. The general population remained unaware of how close they regularly came to catastrophic reality breaks, dimensional invasions, or temporal paradoxes that could unravel the entire timeline. When the Weavers succeeded in preventing these disasters, the world continued normally, with no one realizing how narrowly they had avoided annihilation. But the family persevered, bound by the understanding that their unique position came with inescapable obligations. They were no longer fully human, but they retained enough of their humanity to care about the fate of their species. They were not gods, but they had accepted godlike responsibilities for the maintenance of cosmic order. The legacy that had begun with Ezekiel Weaver's desperate bargain in a Kentucky hollow had grown into something that transcended individual ambition or even family loyalty. The Weavers had become living embodiments of the principle that consciousness, in all its forms, deserved the chance to exist and grow without being crushed by either absolute chaos or absolute order. Their story had become the hidden history of the modern world, the secret foundation upon which everyday reality rested. Every sunrise that followed the expected sequence, every cause that produced its anticipated effect, every moment of normalcy that allowed human civilization to continue its development, all of it was supported by the invisible work of a family that had sacrificed their ordinary humanity to preserve the extraordinary complexity of existence itself. Yet even as they maintained their cosmic vigil, the Weavers knew that their role was ultimately temporary. The goal was not to control reality indefinitely, but to nurture it toward a state where such control would no longer be necessary. Someday, if they succeeded in their greatest work, consciousness itself would mature enough to maintain the balance between order and chaos without requiring cosmic guardians. As their cosmic responsibilities deepened, the Weavers discovered that maintaining balance across multiple dimensions required more than just their inherited gifts. The threads of reality itself were unraveling at points where universes intersected, creating tiers that threatened to cascade into universal collapse. These dimensional wounds appeared wherever the fabric of existence grew thin, bleeding strange energies that transformed entire regions into spaces where physics operated by alien rules. The first signs manifested in 1923 when Ezekiel's great-grandson, Mordecai Weaver, noticed his looms producing cloth that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The fabric would shimmer in and out of visibility, its patterns shifting between configurations that hurt to observe directly. When worn, these garments allowed the wearer to perceive parallel versions of themselves, glimpsing lives they might have lived in adjacent realities. This discovery led to what the family privately called the Great Unraveling. Across 17 different dimensions, versions of the Weaver family began experiencing simultaneous crises. Their supernatural textiles started producing chaotic effects, granting random abilities that changed hourly, aging some wearers decades and minutes, while making others temporarily immortal. The careful balance they had maintained for generations suddenly teetered on the edge of collapse. The cause became clear when Mordecai's sister, Temperance, discovered that their ancestral bargain had created what she termed resonance echoes. Every supernatural cloth they had ever woven existed not just in their reality, but in countless parallel versions, each one slightly different. These dimensional duplicates had been unconsciously influencing each other across the boundaries between worlds, creating a web of cause and effect that spanned infinite realities. In dimensions where the Weavers had never existed, reality remained stable, but in those universes where they had made their dark bargains, the accumulated supernatural influence was creating pressure points where the barriers between worlds grew dangerously thin. The family realized they weren't just cosmic stewards of their own reality, but unwitting architects of a multiversal crisis. The entities they had long worked with, the unravelers and architects, revealed themselves to be representatives of competing cosmic forces locked in an eternal struggle. The unravelers sought to dissolve the boundaries between dimensions entirely, believing that separation was an artificial constraint that prevented the universe from achieving its true potential. The architects, conversely, worked to maintain distinct realities, arguing that the mixing of dimensional properties would ultimately destroy everything. The Weavers found themselves caught between these titanic forces, their supernatural textiles serving as both weapons and shields in a war that spanned every possible version of existence. They learned that their looms weren't just tools for weaving cloth, but instruments capable of stitching reality itself, repairing tears in the dimensional fabric, or if misused, creating wounds that could split entire universes in half. Mordecai developed techniques for what he called dimensional weaving, creating cloths that could seal rifts between worlds. These garments required materials harvested from the boundaries between realities themselves, substances that existed in quantum superposition until observed. The process was extraordinarily dangerous, as a single mistake could trap the weaver between dimensions, leaving them to exist as a consciousness spread across infinite variations of themselves. The family's role evolved from mere supernatural craftsmen to multiversal healers. They traveled between dimensions, identifying points where reality had become unstable and working to repair the damage. Their tools expanded beyond traditional looms to include devices that could measure dimensional tension, detect approaching universal collapse, and communicate across the barriers between worlds. However, this expanded role came with terrible personal costs. Extended exposure to multidimensional energies began transforming the Weavers in ways that made their previous supernatural changes seem mild. Family members started existing in multiple states simultaneously, their consciousness fragmented across parallel versions of themselves. Some could only communicate by weaving messages into cloth, their voices having been scattered across dimensions. The most disturbing development was temporal displacement. Weavers would age at different rates in different dimensions, leading to situations where a single person might be simultaneously young in one reality and ancient in another. Family gatherings became surreal affairs where the same individual would appear at multiple ages, their various dimensional selves sometimes disagreeing about important decisions. Temperance discovered that their condition was slowly spreading to others. People who wore Weaver textiles for extended periods began experiencing dimensional echoes themselves, catching glimpses of parallel lives and alternate histories. Entire communities in Weaver's Hollow started reporting shared dreams of other versions of their town, some where the Hollow was a thriving city, others where it had never been settled at all. The breaking point came when the family realized that their activities were creating what they termed cascade failures. Repairing one dimensional tear would sometimes cause three others to appear elsewhere, as the stress of healing one reality was transferred to the boundaries between other worlds. They were fighting a war against entropy itself, trying to hold together a multiverse that seemed determined to dissolve into chaos. In desperation, the Weavers attempted to trace their condition back to its source. Using techniques that allowed them to perceive the deep history of their bloodline across multiple dimensions, they discovered that the original entity Ezekiel had bargained with in 1847 was not what they had believed. The presence that had taught him to weave supernatural cloth was itself a refugee from a dimension that had already collapsed, a survivor of a universe where the barriers between realities had completely dissolved. This entity, which they now understood to be called the Hollow Weaver, had been searching across infinite dimensions for a reality stable enough to serve as an anchor point for its continued existence. By teaching the Weaver family their techniques, it had been slowly transforming their universe into a suitable host, using their supernatural textiles as a kind of dimensional root system that would allow it to permanently establish itself in their reality. The family faced an impossible choice. They could continue their work as multiversal healers, knowing that each repair brought them closer to complete dimensional dissolution, or they could attempt to sever their connection to the supernatural entirely, potentially dooming not just their own reality, but all the parallel worlds they had sworn to protect. The decision was complicated by the fact that they were no longer entirely human. Generations of supernatural weaving had transformed them into beings that existed partially outside normal space-time. Cutting their connection to the supernatural might not just end their abilities, but erase them from existence entirely, removing them from the timeline as if they had never been born. As the crisis deepened, younger members of the family began proposing radical solutions. Mordecai's daughter, Seraphina, suggested that instead of fighting the dimensional collapse, they should guide it, using their abilities to merge selected realities in controlled ways. This would create a new kind of universe, one where the boundaries between worlds were permeable but stable, allowing for the kind of multidimensional existence the family had accidentally achieved. The proposal was controversial even within the family. Some members argued that such a merger would destroy the unique character of individual realities, creating a homogenized existence where the infinite variety of possible worlds would be lost. Others contended that the current system was unsustainable and that controlled collapse was preferable to chaotic dissolution. The debate raged across multiple dimensions, with different versions of the family reaching different conclusions. In some realities, the Weavers chose to attempt Seraphina's merger plan. In others, they decided to sacrifice themselves to preserve the dimensional barriers. The lack of consensus across parallel versions of themselves created additional instability, as their multidimensional nature meant that contradictory decisions in different realities began canceling each other out. The situation reached a critical point when the family discovered that their indecision was itself becoming a force of destruction. The quantum uncertainty created by their inability to choose a single course of action was manifesting as reality storms, chaotic events where multiple possible outcomes occurred simultaneously. The Weaver family's transformation into multidimensional guardians was merely the beginning of their most terrifying chapter. As cosmic entities tasked with maintaining the balance between order and chaos, they discovered that their responsibilities extended far beyond mere protection. They had become the universe's debt collectors, and every thread they had ever woven across time and space was now coming due for payment. In the quantum realm between dimensions, the Weavers established what they called the Reconciliation Chamber, a space where the accumulated consequences of their centuries of manipulation could be processed and balanced. Here, time moved differently. Past, present, and future existed simultaneously, allowing them to witness the full scope of their actions across all realities. What they saw defied comprehension even by their enhanced consciousness. Every life they had touched, every reality they had altered, every moment they had rewoven had created ripple effects that cascaded through existence like stones thrown into an infinite pond. The merchant in 1847 Kentucky, whose life Ezekiel had extended through supernatural means, had lived to father 17 children instead of 3. Those additional 14 lives had each spawned their own timelines, creating exponential branches of reality that stretched across centuries. Each branch demanded its own resolution, its own balancing of cosmic debt. The Echo Weavers, those fragments of consciousness left behind by their dimensional manipulations, had evolved into something far more complex than simple residual energy. They had become autonomous entities, shadow versions of the Weaver family that existed in the spaces between realities. These Echo Weavers operated according to their own logic, continuing to weave and manipulate reality, but without the cosmic oversight that now governed the true Weavers. They were, in essence, the family's uncontrolled legacy running wild across the multiverse. The Prime Loom revealed to the Weavers that the Echo Weavers represented a fundamental threat to universal stability. Unlike the original family, who had been bound by cosmic accords and divine mandate, these echoes operated purely on instinct and desire. They wove without purpose, created without consideration, and destroyed without conscience. They were the Weaver family's power stripped of wisdom, their abilities divorced from responsibility. The first major Echo Weaver manifestation occurred in a reality where the American Civil War had never ended. In this timeline, the conflict had raged for over a century, sustained by supernatural forces that prevented either side from achieving decisive victory. The Echo Weaver responsible for this perpetual warfare had been born from the Weaver family's manipulation of historical events in the 1860s. It fed on the conflict itself, growing stronger with each battle, each death, each moment of despair generated by the endless war. When the Weavers attempted to enter this reality to correct the distortion, they encountered resistance unlike anything they had faced before. The Echo Weaver had not merely altered history, it had made itself integral to the fabric of that reality. To remove it would cause the entire timeline to collapse, potentially destroying billions of lives. Yet to leave it in place meant condemning that reality to eternal conflict. This dilemma represented the cruel mathematics of cosmic responsibility. The Weavers realized that their greatest challenge was not managing the threads of reality, but dealing with the consequences of their past manipulations. Every solution created new problems. Every correction demanded new sacrifices. They had become trapped in an endless cycle of cosmic debt management, where each payment required borrowing against future possibilities. The architects, those beings of pure order who had helped establish the cosmic accords, began to express concern about the Weaver family's methods. They argued that the Weavers' approach to problem solving, rooted in manipulation and control, was fundamentally incompatible with the kind of balance the universe required. The architects favored surgical precision, minimal intervention, and respect for natural cosmic law. The Weavers, by contrast, operated through comprehensive restructuring, reality-wide modifications, and the subordination of cosmic law to desired outcomes. This philosophical divide led to the formation of opposing factions within the cosmic hierarchy. The architects allied themselves with beings who favored stability and preservation of existing order. The Weavers found themselves aligned with entities that embraced change and transformation, even if such change came at tremendous cost. The Unravelers, those forces of chaos that had once opposed the Weavers, now found themselves in the strange position of sometimes supporting Weaver actions that increased cosmic entropy. The conflict came to a head when the Weavers attempted to address the Echo Weaver crisis through what they called the Great Consolidation. Their plan involved gathering all the scattered echoes across every reality and reintegrating them into a single, controlled entity. This would require temporarily destabilizing the barriers between dimensions, potentially exposing billions of realities to catastrophic interference. The architects viewed this plan as unacceptably dangerous and moved to prevent its implementation. What followed was the first war fought entirely within the conceptual space between realities, where the weapons were competing visions of cosmic order and the battleground was the fundamental structure of existence itself. The war manifested differently across various realities. In some timelines, it appeared as natural disasters of unprecedented scale. In others, it took the form of technological failures that brought civilizations to their knees. In certain realities, it expressed itself as widespread madness, as mortal minds struggled to process the cosmic conflict occurring just beyond their perception. On Earth, as if the effects were subtle but profound, sensitive individuals began reporting shared dreams of vast looms operated by shadowy figures. Artists found themselves compelled to create works depicting impossible geometries and non Euclidean spaces. Scientists discovered anomalies in their data that suggested the laws of physics were fluctuating in microscopic but measurable ways. The Weaver family themselves experienced the war as a fragmentation of their consciousness. They found themselves simultaneously existing in multiple states of being, sometimes aligned with their original purpose, sometimes embodying their Echo Weaver shadows, sometimes serving as unwilling agents of the architect's vision of order. This multiplication of self across conflicting realities created a form of cosmic schizophrenia that threatened to tear apart their unified consciousness. During the war's most intense phase, the boundaries between different versions of reality became so thin that individuals began spontaneously shifting between timelines. A person might go to sleep in a world where they had 3 children and wake up in a reality where they had 5, with memories of both timelines existing simultaneously in their minds. The Weaver family recognized that their war with the architects was causing exactly the kind of cosmic disruption they had been appointed to prevent. The irony was not lost on them that in their efforts to maintain universal balance, they had become the primary source of universal chaos. This realization forced them to confront a fundamental question about the nature of their power and responsibility. The resolution came through an unexpected source: the mortal descendants of those whose lives the Weavers had originally touched in 1847. These individuals, spread across multiple realities and timelines, had developed their own form of supernatural sensitivity. They began to spontaneously organize, drawn together by shared dreams and inexplicable compulsions. These descendants, who called themselves the Thread Keepers, possessed a unique ability to perceive the connections between different realities without being overwhelmed by the cosmic scope of such perception. They could see the patterns that linked all versions of existence while remaining grounded in their mortal perspective. Most importantly, they could communicate with both the Weavers and the Echo Weavers in ways that transcended the cosmic hierarchy's conflicts. The Thread Keepers proposed a solution that neither the Weavers nor the architects had considered. Instead of trying to control or eliminate the Echo Weavers, why not give them purpose? The Echoes existed because they embodied the Weaver family's drive to create and transform. Rather than viewing this as a flaw to be corrected, the Thread Keepers suggested it could be channeled into constructive cosmic maintenance. This proposal led to the establishment of the Weaving Corps, a vast organization that encompassed the original Weaver family, their Echo Weaver shadows, mortal Thread Keepers from across realities, and reformed members of both the Architect and Unraveler factions. The Corps operated on principles of distributed responsibility, where no single entity or group could make unilateral decisions about cosmic intervention. The Weaving Corps divided the multiverse into sectors, with different teams responsible for monitoring and maintaining the stability of specific reality clusters. The original Weavers served as senior coordinators, their cosmic perspective allowing them to identify large-scale patterns and potential problems. The Echo Weavers were assigned to active intervention roles, their instinctive creativity channeled into solving specific reality distortions. The Thread Keepers provided crucial mortal perspective, ensuring that cosmic decisions took into account the lived experiences of beings within affected realities. Under this new system, the Weaver family's role evolved from cosmic dictators to cosmic facilitators. They no longer imposed their will upon reality, but instead worked to enable reality's natural tendency toward balance and growth. This shift required them to develop entirely new skills, moving from manipulation to collaboration, from control to guidance, from isolation to integration. The transition was not without its challenges. Many of the Echo Weavers struggled with their new constraints, having existed for so long without oversight or purpose beyond immediate desire. Some rejected the core entirely, choosing to operate as cosmic rogues in the spaces between organized realities. These rogue echoes became the subject of specialized containment teams, though their capture and rehabilitation remained an ongoing challenge. The establishment of the Weaving Core also required the development of new forms of cosmic law and governance. The old system of divine mandate and hierarchical authority proved inadequate for managing an organization that spanned multiple realities and included beings of vastly different natures and capabilities. The Core pioneered what they called consensus reality management, where major decisions required agreement from representatives of all affected realities. This democratic approach to cosmic governance created its own complications. Debates that might have been resolved in moments by divine fiat now required extensive consultation and negotiation. Some urgent interventions were delayed by bureaucratic processes, leading to preventable disasters. The Core had to develop rapid response protocols that balanced democratic accountability with the need for quick action in crisis situations. The Weaver family found themselves adapting to roles they had never imagined. Ezekiel, the original patriarch, became the Core's chief historian, using his intimate knowledge of their past manipulations to predict and prevent similar problems. His wife, Martha, evolved into a counselor for Echo Weavers, struggling with their new constraints, her maternal instincts proving invaluable in helping these chaotic entities find constructive purpose. Their children took on various specialized roles within the cores. Some became reality architects, designing new timelines to replace those too damaged by past interventions to be repaired. Others served as diplomatic liaisons, facilitating communication between the core and independent cosmic entities. A few embraced roles as field agents, working directly within mortal realities to address problems at their source. The most significant change for the Weaver family was the loss of their unique status as cosmic manipulators. They were no longer the sole arbitrators of reality's fate, but merely participants in a much larger system of cosmic maintenance. This democratization of their power was both liberating and terrifying. They gained the support and collaboration of countless other beings, but they also lost the absolute control that had defined their existence for centuries. As the Weaving Core matured and expanded, it began to attract attention from cosmic entities beyond the local multiverse cluster. Reports reached them of similar reality-weaving families in distant cosmic regions, some of whom had followed paths remarkably similar to the Weaver's own journey. These discoveries suggested that the Weaver phenomenon was not unique, but rather represented a recurring pattern in cosmic evolution. Contact with these other reality weaving entities opened new possibilities for the Corps. They began to exchange techniques, share resources, and coordinate their efforts across previously unimaginable distances. The Weaver family found themselves part of an even larger community of cosmic gardeners, all working to maintain the health and stability of the infinite garden of realities. Yet, even as they celebrated these connections and achievements, the Weavers remained haunted by a fundamental question. Had they truly found balance, or had they simply created a more elaborate form of cosmic manipulation? The Corps operated with noble intentions and democratic principles, but it still represented an organized effort to control and direct the evolution of reality. The line between guidance and manipulation remained frustratingly unclear. This uncertainty would drive the next phase of their cosmic evolution. As the Weaver family grappled with questions that went to the very heart of existence itself, in a universe where every action created reactions, where every solution generated new problems, was it possible to truly help without also harming? Could they ever escape the cycle of cosmic debt they had created? Or were they doomed to spend eternity managing the consequences of their past choices? The shadows of Appalachia have always been patient, and their hunger eternal. These bloodlines thought they had negotiated temporary arrangements, seasonal tributes, manageable costs for their prosperity. But the mountains remember every whispered bargain, every drop of blood offered in desperation, every soul traded for fleeting success. The Weavers learned what countless others discovered too late. In the ancient hollows where mist clings like memory, debts are never truly paid, only transferred from one generation to the next. Tonight, when the wind carries voices through the pines and the darkness feels too thick to breathe, remember that some family names are best left unspoken, for speaking them aloud might just remind the shadows that new contracts are always welcome.